Well, thank you, Rowan. Good morning, everyone. I'm here this morning speaking on behalf of my colleagues at Deloitte. At Deloitte, we have a particular interest in Western Sydney. We have an office here, as you would know, and it isn't just that we have our naming rights on a building here in central Parramatta, but Western Sydney, uniquely amongst our internal divisions, has the same status as any of the other states. So it's a recognised part of our world in Deloitte, hiring as we do 7,000 people around the country. We've also had a special focus on this part of the world with our Shaping Future Cities program. You may have had some exposure to that particular piece of work, which again draws particular attention to Western Sydney and its potential. Well, today what I'd like to do is to give a complementary presentation to the one we've just had from Tim, which builds on these insights, introduced to us in fact by the Minister, about what it is that drives city growth. And in doing so, I want to draw on some work that we published last year in a series we called Building the Lucky Country. Last year we published a piece called The Purpose of Place Reconsidered, and it particularly focused on cities. You'll see at your seats the next in this particular series, which we call What's Over the Horizon. The little flyer there that introduces you to number 6 in the Building the Lucky Country series. Numbers 3, 4, 5 and 6 are all available at a booth just outside this auditorium when we break for coffee. If you're interested in some of the things that I've said this morning, you might like to pick up one or more of those publications and take them with you. You'd be very welcome indeed. So let me now, for the next 15 minutes or so, talk about Western Sydney and some of the drivers of growth. Then it'll be my privilege to invite some others to the lectern here, up to the dais, and I'll convene a panel where we'll expose some of these issues at greater length, including, of course, bringing Tim back as well at that point. Then you'll have the opportunity to ask any of us, myself included, some questions during question time until we break at about 10:40. So while I'm speaking, and maybe you've already got some questions for Tim, you might like to think about some of the things you'd like to raise when we get there. So growing the economy of Western Sydney. We've had a number of stats, including from Tim and Minister Taylor this morning about Western Sydney. It's not hard to pick up the picture that Western Sydney is growing very quickly and also that it's significantly large to begin with. You can see from that slide that Western Sydney, according to our estimates, is home to 1 in 10 Australians and with a GDP which represents roughly 8% of the national GDP. The Minister mentioned 300,000. I've got a slide here that says 200,000, but there's no doubt that the growth of population is outstripping the growth of jobs in this part of the world. So we need more employment. The airport has been given quite a bit of airplay. That's terrific news. One of the drivers of city growth, as the Minister pointed out, is airports. It's not the only one. Universities and hospitals are also strong drivers of growth in cities, and you've got one of each at least. So the airport sort of builds for you the troika, if you like, that will significantly drive growth in this area and develop the jobs that the region needs. At the moment, most of the jobs are in the manufacturing sector. That's sort of good news and bad news. Advanced manufacturing will be very much a part of the future for our country, but traditional manufacturing will become less and less important as this economy grows. We are becoming, as you well know, a services-dominated economy. It doesn't mean that manufacturing necessarily shrinks. It means that it becomes less important as the economy grows. It produces or is responsible for a smaller and smaller share of output. In other words, if you want jobs to grow, you've got to look to other areas than traditional manufacturing. Elaborate manufacturing will create jobs, not necessarily in large numbers, but jobs which pay well. So they're certainly part of the formula. Plenty of business growth here. We want to see more of that. And one of the strengths of this part of the country is the diversity of its people. That diversity is an important, significant driver of growth in the knowledge economy. I'll say a little bit more about that later. But some of the issues which it presents, I won't be telling you anything if I suggest to you that there are social issues that can arise as a result of this same phenomenon. We have to manage those as we have done in the past. Our country is one of the world's great immigrant countries. We know how to deal with this. We also know that it creates challenges. We know most importantly that it's a wonderful economic driver. And in the knowledge economy, ladies and gentlemen, much more so than it has been in the past. In the past, we brought labourers to this country mostly to engage in originally primary industry and then manufacturing industry. This time, into the future, we need to bring people here to become part of the knowledge economy. And a more diverse population from different places with different ideas and different cultures, that's the essence of growth in the knowledge economy, and you've got that here in Western Sydney. So increasingly, again, as the Minister pointed out this morning, what happens in Western Sydney is important for what happens in Australia. So the spotlight is on you, and it's hardly surprising that the federal government, even setting politics aside for a moment, is thinking about another city deal with Western Sydney. This is a significant area of economic growth in its own right, and it's right there on the national radar screen. Well, in this paper that I've referred to, The Purpose of Place Reconsidered, we point out that when you think about the prosperity of a region, you do need to think more broadly than just its economics. At the end of the day, people are interested in the livability of a place. Its prosperity is tied up with that livability, obviously. If you want to think about it narrowly, you can think about the mismatch that the Minister pointed out between jobs and houses. That's one stark distinction that you can draw, that it's pointing to the same thing. It's all very well to be able to live here in an affordable house, but if you haven't got a job, there's a problem. And if you have got a job that pays well where housing is exceptionally expensive, then maybe you're no better off there either. So livability is about a package of things that builds off work and place. We speak about the 10 dimensions of prosperity, and we divide them up, as you can see in that chart, between inputs, boosters, and outputs. The outputs are the things that ultimately you're interested in: health and safety, material standards, natural amenity, and local amenities. And you can drive those things depending, of course, on the input, some of which you can do something about, like human resources. Others of which are more naturally set, natural resources, although that can be added to over time, of course, through exploration. Physical capital can be built and constructed, including things like airports. Those are inputs to this prosperity equation. But very importantly, you drive the link between the inputs and the outputs. So it's not just a matter of building more inputs. That's important, but you don't just have to build more stuff. The piece in the middle is in many ways more important. Social capital, entrepreneurship and innovation, leadership and contribution. These are things that can be built and cultivated without turning a sod. These are things which are driven by society, by governance, by attitudes, by people. And they're very important boosters of the inputs. To take stark examples, there are many around the world, including countries, for example, like Mozambique, which are exceptionally well endowed with natural resources, also well endowed with human resources, not much in physical capital side of things, but you find countries like that can be desperately poor nevertheless, because they lack many of the boosters and other social criteria, which take those inputs and convert them into the sorts of things that ultimately drive human well-being. Those things on the bottom of the chart there, outputs. Well, that's how you think about prosperity, and I put this up here specifically to counter a view in some people's minds that all economists think about is one of those, namely material standards of living, if you like, or jobs and incomes. They're clearly on the list. But no one who thinks about livability, development, and prosperity in the broad would ever just narrowly focus on that. Necessary, but not sufficient. Now, here's what we call a spider chart. There are a number of them in the document itself, contrasting different parts of Australia. And all we simply do is take those 10 dimensions of prosperity and plot, based upon ABS data, where different places are around our country. And this is a chart which compares inner Sydney with Western Sydney. You can see that inner Sydney is marked in the broken lines and Western Sydney in the solid lines. The further you are away from the centre of this spider chart or radar chart, some people call them, the more highly ranked you are, according to the data on those different criteria. Well, a quick glance shows you a couple of things. Firstly, it shows you that Western Sydney has strengths relative to inner Sydney, but not dominating strengths. Health and safety is a strong dimension for Western Sydney, which reflects your hospitals and also reflects the fact that you're not living in an inner city environment. But for the other dimensions, you can see even those ones that you can do something about. Generally speaking, Western Sydney is dominated, just to pick one, by inner Sydney. Dominated in areas of physical capital, clearly social capital, obviously innovation, entrepreneurship, leadership and contribution, the boosters of growth that we spoke about before. Well, natural amenity, sure, there's not much you can do about the fact that you're not near the harbour, but you're not that far away. So there are people who are further way downward, behind you when it comes to natural amenity. Local amenities, human resources very strongly, natural resources, well, neither in Western Sydney nor the City of Sydney particularly highly ranked on that criterion relative to the rest of the country. The point of a chart like this is to do two things. Firstly, is to sort of plot where you are relative to other comparators. In this case, you might think of the city of inner Sydney. So, then what sorts of things could you do to build yourself out from where you are? And also identifying where your strengths already are relative to other parts of the country. So even though you're not as highly ranked, for example, as inner Sydney, Western Sydney is still well ranked on local amenities compared with other parts of the country. Now, all it does is give you a picture. Ideally, what you'd like to be able to do is to catalyse what we call in the paper flourishing and avoid the opposite of flourishing, which is languishing. You see, cities and regions, places are dynamic things. And you can turn that dynamism in your favour by moving from where you are closer to the borders, in other words, catalysing flourishing in the place, or you can do its opposite. You can either neglect things or make poor decisions, and you can produce languishing. This is a dynamic process. You need to engage with it. It's not as if it's just standing still. Doing nothing is a decision that can lead you in the direction of languishing rather than flourishing. Well, if it's a dynamic process, what are the sorts of things that could drive it? Well, obviously there are things that are happening outside, things that will happen anyway. In the most recent of our Building the Lucky Country series, number 6, the one you have a little flyer for in your seat, we talk about what's over the horizon. This is specifically for Australia rather than Western Sydney in particular. And here we develop at least 3 scenarios for the future of our country and point out how those scenarios would drive economic activity and prosperity more broadly in Australia. I've just taken one of them and given you a very brief sense of how that particular scenario, where Australia surfs Asia's third wave of growth, how that might filter down to Western Sydney. Well, those figures there you can see on the chart, Australia producing an extra $650 billion over 20 years, more national income, jobs and employment, tourism and manufacturing, nevertheless falling as a result of that. Observe that. The growth of Asia will stimulate the growth of services. And even in the back of another wave of growth in Asia, our manufacturing will continue to shrink as a share of output. That's for the nation at large. If you think about what that might mean for Western Sydney, well, you'll get a slice of that because you're big in relation to the nation. You may get even more because the wave of tourism which follows a scenario like that is particularly going to affect Western Sydney, given that you've got an airport coming. That's terrific news for you. On the other hand, it draws attention to the fact that most of the employment in this part of the country is dominated by manufacturing. And manufacturing, as I keep saying, will be a less of a share. It'll represent a smaller share of output as time goes by. It needs to be transformed. You need more and different jobs. Even if the tide is coming in for the whole country in a scenario like this one. Well, what are the levers that you can pull? I was fascinated this morning in listening to Minister Taylor to hear him, on behalf of the government, essentially tick each of these boxes here. This is what our research points to as well. The dynamic forces that push you from where you are in the direction of flourishing and avoid languishing, whatever place you're in, basically boil down to these. People, well, you've got strong growth in people, and the diversity, which I've spoken about before, which is a clear strength. Community, we need to do this together. We need to build on what binds us, the things that we hold in common, a number of which have been mentioned this morning, including football and so forth. But it's broader than that. People don't just come to live in a place. They come to be part of a community, and that needs to be recognised and developed. Technology, the Minister mentioned, is one of the most important drivers we have for enabling place, for enabling us to live together in ways which increasingly don't have us tripping over one another. And finally, governance. There was an emphasis again this morning in the Minister's presentation about all the different levels of government being part of this. Well, governance is broader than that. Governance is exactly how we express our individual wants and preferences collectively. What sorts of systems do we have in place to ensure that people have a say in how the place they happen to live or work develops? So those are the drivers. They're the dynamic forces. And finally, who is it who can act? This was the major point of this piece of work that we did last year. Lots of people think when it comes to these sorts of issues, well, at the end of the day, the government has to do something. The government has to. So the government needs to build an airport. The government needs to build a university or a hospital or whatever. Well, yes, indeed. Those things are important. The government can act. But the most important message of this piece of work, ladies and gentlemen, is this. It's collaboration that starts the driver. It's the collaboration amongst all of these different partners that will catalyse this growth, which is to say that businesses, communities and individuals don't need to just wait around for the government to act, that is to say. Any of these groups can independently break into this circle of flourishing, this virtuous circle, and catalyse development in the direction of flourishing and away from languishing. Importantly, the piece that we did for Deloitte, of course, was mainly directed at our commercial clients, to businesses. And the message to business was very clear. Inside this engine of flourishing is commercial return. What the digital revolution is doing is eliminating scale economies as the basis of increases in profit over time. That's gone. So if you're asking yourself, where will the growth come from? What will drive the growth in my profits and my shareholder value over time? Our view strongly is increasingly the answer are things that technically are called economies of agglomeration, not economies of scale. Economies of agglomeration are driven by people acting together in place. And what drives that growth in the knowledge economy is the increasing sparking of innovation, new ideas and creativity, which comes when we gather together as human beings in place, and those places work. They're livable, they're workable, we get together, they drive creativity and innovation, which drives growth. Now, if that's true, business has as much to gain from making these places work as government does. So it isn't just about making it easier to get us around, go to the doctor if we have to go to the doctor, get the kids to school, take a university course. Therefore, the government needs to build more railways and roads and universities and hospitals. That's part of it. But business can collaborate with government and communities in delivering those outcomes. Building businesses, building community off the back of those physical assets, building its own physical assets and investing, being a part of the collective growth for its own interest. We're not asking business necessarily here just to be charitable. We're not asking business not to be charitable. But we're not appealing to corporate social responsibility. That has a different role to play. We're appealing to businesses' enlightened self-interest. If this works, folks, this is a source of growth in prosperity. It's a source of growth in living standards, and it replaces the traditional growth that's been driven ultimately by scale economies. Technology has left that world behind. That's 19th century, 20th century thinking. 21st century thinking is based on the economies of place. I'd encourage you to take a look at this in more detail. If you're interested in some of the ideas I've just expressed, we put them out there. What we'd like to do now is to move to a panel discussion where we can unpack some of these ideas by giving specific examples from our panellists about what's happening here, drawing Tim in with some of his insights as well, and inviting you in the audience to make a contribution. So let me now invite Rowan back to introduce the panellists, and you'll hear from me again in a few minutes. Thank you.